There are days that aren't sad, yet not quite joyful quiet like a still lake untouched by wind. You go about your usual tasks, speak, smile, fulfill your roles, and yet, somewhere deep inside, something feels both missing and too much. It's not an obvious pain, nor is it complete happiness, just an undefined emptiness, like a shadow cast with no light. That's when you begin to wonder, is there something I've yet to truly touch in this life? Not wealth, not achievement, but a certain feeling subtle and personal, the feeling of coming home to yourself, a place where you no longer have to perform, no longer need to appear strong, no longer carry the weight of roles worn thin. It's that sensation when you finally sit down, exhale slowly, and realize you don't need to prove anything anymore. We all wear layers of expectation, of obligation, of who we're supposed to be. But beneath them all is something pure, something unshaken, quietly waiting to be seen. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply longs to be acknowledged. And perhaps that's what you're searching for too. So let's sit together and begin a different kind of journey, not one that takes us far, but one that gently leads us inward. Here, you won't be told how to live. No one will instruct you to awaken. Instead, we'll share stories light as wind, deep as spring water, simple as life itself. These are Zen stories, ancient and subtle. Sometimes it takes only a glance, a smile, or a quiet nod to open a door we never noticed in our minds. They don't come to teach you something new, but to remind you of what you already know and may have forgotten. Perhaps it's the quiet art of letting go, like a leaf falling without resistance, or the still strength of patience, like water that never rushes yet shapes everything. Maybe it's the soft freedom of no longer defending anything, like the smile of one who simply is. If you listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart, each story becomes a drop of dew falling gently into a dry place in the mind. So now, let the noise outside fade. Soften your shoulders. Take a deep, easy breath. Ahead lies a stream of stories, not to teach, but to touch. A path not toward somewhere new, but gently back to where you've always been. Inside, here, now. A journey not for those seeking more knowledge, but for those ready to rest in what's already true. There's a kind of quiet that lives only in the early hours, before the world fully wakes. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of gentle presence, like the hush of a breath just before it's released. You step into the hush, now, as if through an unseen doorway, and find yourself in the heart of a village, nestled among the low hills of ancient Japan. The air is crisp, tender on the skin, like a silk scarf drawn lightly across your cheek. The scent of earth, wood smoke, and something sweet, perhaps cherry blossoms, rises with each breeze. There is no urgency here. Even time seems to pause, as though it, too, wishes to stretch and yawn before beginning again. The path beneath your feet is narrow, made of worn dirt that remembers the tread of generations. It winds gently between simple wooden houses with thatched roofs and sliding paper doors, each home standing not in proud display, but in quiet belonging. They lean into the land, not to conquer it, but to dwell with it. You walk slowly. There is no reason to rush. A bird calls from somewhere high in the pines, its song a thread of silver sound weaving through the air. You follow that thread past stone lanterns, vegetable gardens, and tiny shrines nestled between rocks, almost as if the earth itself had opened to cradle them. There are no gates to keep you out, no signs to tell you what you must believe. Just the feeling, immediate and true, that this place knows peace. As you round a gentle bend, you come upon a quiet clearing where a stream glides across smooth stones. The water's voice is low and playful, like laughter told in whispers. Children's sandals lie nearby, forgotten in their play. A wooden bridge arches across the stream, its railings worn smooth by countless hands. It is here that you pause, not because something dramatic happens, but precisely because it doesn't. This stillness, this utter lack of spectacle, it invites you in. It allows you to soften. Your breath lengthens without effort. Your shoulders drop. And for the first time in what feels like days, or perhaps years, you realize you are not carrying anything, not even yourself. Across the stream stands a modest dwelling, thatched roof, bamboo fence, a garden with wildflowers growing alongside radishes and onions. Lanterns hang beside the doorway, their faded paper dancing gently in the breeze. The home is humble, yet unmistakably cared for. There is reverence in its simplicity, as if each board and stone had been placed with a listening heart. This is the home of Hakuin. You do not know him yet, not truly, but even from a distance, you feel the pull of his presence not as a force, but as a stillness. Children gather near him beneath a flowering tree, their laughter ringing like wind chimes. He kneels among them, his robe tucked under his legs, hands resting in his lap. His face is weathered but soft, like an old river stone shaped by years of flowing water. When he speaks, you cannot hear the words, but you feel their rhythm, like distant drums that echo in your chest. Villagers pass through the garden throughout the morning. Some bring baskets of fruit, others bring nothing but questions, and all leave the same way with lighter shoulders, slower steps, and a gaze that now looks not just at the world, but into it. You stay a while, seated beneath a nearby tree, simply watching. There is no performance here. No one rushes to impress. Even the act of seeking advice is free of drama. A woman with tearful eyes speaks with Hakuin, her fingers knotting the fabric of her sleeve. He listens with his whole body, not leaning forward, not reacting, but simply receiving. And then, at just the right moment, he offers something, not always words. Sometimes only a silence that makes space for her to hear herself. You begin to understand wisdom does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes. It is the quiet rain that softens the soil, allowing seeds to stir. As the sun climbs higher, light dapples through the trees, dancing on the surface of a wooden wash basin. A man walks by with a yoke over his shoulders. 2 pails of water, swinging gently. His eyes meet yours. He bows. You return the gesture. No words, just the silent acknowledgement that here, in this place, being is enough, somewhere. A bell chimes a soft, clear tone that seems to settle into the very marrow of your bones. You wander a bit farther, letting your feet lead, past a weaving loom set near an open window, past rows of herbs drying in the sun, past an old woman brushing the temple steps with care that speaks not of duty, but devotion. Eventually, You find yourself back near Hakuin's garden. The children have wandered off. The visitors have gone. He remains, seated among his vegetables, pulling weeds with steady hands. You watch, unnoticed, as he pauses to lift a small worm from the soil and place it gently on a leaf. Out of harm's way, he does not speak, but the gesture says everything. This village is not perfect. Later, you will hear whispers, feel tension, witness storms both outer and inner. But in this moment, before all of that, you rest in its stillness. Not because nothing happens here, but because everything that does is touched by presence. You close your eyes. You let yourself fall, not asleep, but inward. And in the hush between one breath and the next, you feel it, a life not measured by noise, but by noticing, a path not paved with grand ideas, but small kindnesses, a peace not sought, but remembered, and perhaps, without quite knowing why, you smile. It begins not with a thunderclap, but a murmur. Whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, begin to weave through the village first faint, almost indistinguishable from the usual chatter. A glance held a moment too long. A basket exchanged without the usual smile. Something has shifted, though you can't yet say what. The peace you had come to know, the gentle rhythm of the village, carries on, but beneath its surface, a quiet tension begins to hum. One afternoon, as the light softens into gold and shadows stretch across the garden paths, you hear it clearly for the first time. Two women by the well, speaking in hushed voices, glance toward the temple, then away again. Their words are muffled by the water they draw, but one phrase floats unmistakably through the air. The young woman, the baby, Hakuin. Your chest tightens not from fear, but confusion. Later that evening, you walk the familiar path toward the village's edge, hoping the cool air will settle your thoughts. But even the breeze seems to carry fragments of unrest. By the following morning, it is no longer whispers, it is accusation. The father of the young woman arrives, red-faced and trembling with fury, his wife beside him, eyes burning with humiliation. Their daughter stands a few steps behind, her gaze fixed on the ground, her hands clutching the folds of her kimono as if they might keep her from dissolving. Villagers gather, drawn by the rising voices. You are among them, standing near the edge of Hakuin's garden, beneath the same flowering tree where children had once laughed. The air feels thick, like it's holding its breath. You have brought shame upon our daughter. The man spits, each word sharp and deliberate. Everyone believed you to be a man of virtue, a master of wisdom. But now we see who you truly are. He points an accusatory finger at Hakuin, whose hands are still dusted with soil from tending the garden. The crowd watches, silent but electric with anticipation, and in that charged space, you along with everyone else wait. Will he protest? Will he raise his voice, deny it with righteous fury, explain the truth? But Hakuin does none of these. He simply looks up, meets the father's blazing eyes with a gaze as calm as a moonlit pond, and says, softly, "Is that so?" The words barely stir the air, so light, so unassuming, that you almost don't hear them. But their weight is undeniable. Silence follows, not peaceful this time, but stunned. The father blinks, thrown off balance. The mother's mouth opens slightly, then closes again. Even the daughter looks up, startled not by resistance, but by the absence of it. And then, as if not knowing how else to respond, they turn and leave. Their footsteps crack the stillness. The murmurs resume behind them like waves returning after a sudden still. That night, the village shifts. Doors that once opened warmly to Hakuin now creak shut when he passes. Neighbors who had once sought his guidance cross the road to avoid him. The laughter of children no longer fills his garden. The lanterns by his door flicker alone. And yet, nothing in him seems to change. At dawn, he still fetches water from the well. He still pulls weeds from between the herbs. He still bows gently to the rising sun, as if it were his oldest companion. When a passing voice hurls the word shame in his direction, he simply bows again, softly repeating the same 3 words. Is that so? You watch this unfold not as a distant observer, but with a growing ache in your chest. You want to cry out, to explain, to defend. You want to shake the villagers and ask, do you not remember who he is, what he's given you? But Hakuin says nothing, does nothing, offers no resistance. And so, you begin to ask different questions, not to the crowd, but to yourself. What is it in us that longs so deeply to be believed, to be seen as right? What part of us flinches when misunderstood, aches when misjudged? Could there be another way? You return to his garden one evening, hoping he might speak, if not to the village, then at least to you. But when your question forms on your lips, why don't you defend yourself? He only smiles and returns to trimming a sprig of mint, not cold, not dismissive, just complete. In the moment, you begin to understand there is a kind of strength that does not rise to fight, but sinks deeper into stillness, a kind of courage that does not shout, but listens, a kind of truth that does not need to be spoken, because it simply is. The days continue, folding into weeks, and every time someone challenges him, insults him, mocks him, his answer is always the same. Is that so? At first, the words seem evasive, passive, even infuriating, but over time, something begins to shift, not in the village, but in you. You begin to hear the depth in those 3 words, the way they hold space for possibility, the way they neither cling nor reject, but allow what is to simply be. They are not resignation. They are a doorway, a surrender not to injustice, but to what cannot be controlled. You begin to wonder, how would your life feel if you, too, could meet the world with such radical stillness when someone misunderstands you, when a story is told that casts you in shadow, when the world turns its face away? What would happen if, instead of bracing, you breathed if, instead of defending, you stayed soft, not because you are weak, but because your sense of self no longer trembles with every wind? This is what Hakuin shows you, not through sermons, but through silence, not through explanation, but through presence. And so, the village continues, carrying its stories like baskets filled with rumors, but Hakuin does not carry them. He walks empty-handed, empty-hearted not in absence, but in freedom. And watching him, you begin to feel that maybe, just maybe, that freedom is possible for you too. Winter arrives quietly, like a breath held long enough to still the world. Snow settles on rooftops and tree branches, softening the edges of the village. And one morning, beneath that hush, a knock sounds at Hakuin's door. You are there, standing nearby, drawn by something you can't name. The young woman's parents stand at the threshold. Her father speaks first, less rage this time, more resolve. "Since you are the father," he says, holding out a tightly wrapped bundle, "you must care for your child." And with that, they place the infant in Hakuin's arms and walk away, their footsteps swallowed by the snow. You expect him to waver, to question, to show some fracture in his face, but he only looks down at the child, then whispers, "Is that so?" And in that moment, something shifts not just in him, but in you. You watch as he gently opens the cloth, revealing a tiny face, red with cold, lips quivering. The child whimpers, uncertain, and Hakuin, without pause, brings the baby inside, cradling it against his chest. What follows is not dramatic, not miraculous, but quietly extraordinary. Hakuin, the man once revered for his teachings and meditations, now spends his days learning how to hold a bottle, how to soothe a cry, how to keep a tiny flame of life alive. You see him stumbling through new rhythms, warming milk over a fire, padding softly across the floor in the middle of the night, whispering lullabies not for enlightenment, but for sleep. He makes a cradle from a woven basket, lines it with spare cloth. When the child wails, he hums not sacred chants, but soft nonsense sounds, the language of presence. His robe, once pristine, bears small stains now. His hands, once folded in stillness, are often smudged with porridge. But there is a grace in it all. Each movement, though unfamiliar, is filled with care. He does not resist the change. He does not long for the solitude he lost. He simply lives what is in front of him completely. You begin to visit more often, not to ask questions, but to help, carrying firewood, fetching water, washing linens, and in those quiet tasks, you begin to understand this too is meditation. This, too, is awakening. When villagers see him, their eyes still flicker with judgment. A fallen monk, they mutter. A liar, a fraud. Some scoff. Others shake their heads in pity. But Hakuin never explains. He only smiles, rocks the baby gently, and, when questioned, offers the same 3 words. Is that so? The child begins to grow. You witness small miracles. The first smile, unsteady but radiant. The first laugh, bubbling like a spring. First steps, first words each one, an unfolding petal in the quiet garden of their shared life. And Hakuin meets each moment fully. He sings lullabies under moonlight, carves simple toys from driftwood, walks slowly through the village, child strapped to his back, gathering herbs for soup. And though people still whisper, some begin to soften. Children sneak peeks again. A neighbor leaves warm cloth at his door. A passing farmer offers fresh rice. You realize something. This is what love looks like when it is free of needing to be seen, when it is not performance, but presence, not attachment, but devotion. There is no resentment in Hakuin's eyes, no trace of burden. He asks for nothing, explains nothing. He simply gives. And in this giving, he teaches more than any sermon could. You, once an observer, become a student not of Zen in the traditional sense, but of something deeper. The Zen of cradling what life hands you. The Zen of breathing through chaos. The Zen of caring, even when no one understands why. One evening, as snow falls gently again, You sit beside him while he hums a melody to the drowsy child. The fire crackles. The room is dim, warm, full of breath. You whisper, "How do you do it?" He looks at you, not with surprise, but with softness. Do what care for a child that is not yours. Be blamed for something you did not do. Live with their anger and still smile. He listens, then looks down at the baby, now asleep against his chest. Because, he says, in this moment, this child needs to be held. What else is there to do? No philosophy, no explanation, just presence. You don't respond. You simply sit, letting the silence stretch, letting it say what words cannot. And for the first time, you feel it not as a concept, but as truth. To live this life fully is not to avoid its burdens, but to carry them lightly, not to escape injustice, but to meet it with stillness, not to be seen as right, but to love anyway. And in the hush of that winter night, you understand why the villagers' rejection did not break him, because Hakuin's center does not live in their approval. It lives in this moment, in this breath, in this child. Spring returns quietly. The snow has long since melted, giving way to soft green shoots and drifting petals. The air carries the sweet scent of plum blossoms, and the days begin once again to lengthen. In the garden, new herbs stretch toward the light, and birds return to the eaves with songs you'd almost forgotten. The child now walking, laughing, exploring chases butterflies through the grass. His feet are still unsure, his balance wobbly, but his joy is clear. And Hakuin, ever nearby, watches with a calm that runs deep as mountain stone. He does not speak of time lost. He does not mark the days. He does not wonder how long this will last. He simply lives it. Then, one morning, as light filters through the paper screen, there's a presence one you feel even before the knock. At the edge of the garden stands the young woman. Her face is pale, drawn not by anger, but by something softer, perhaps regret. Beside her, her parents. Their posture is different now, not rigid with accusation, but bowed with humility. The father's eyes, once blazing with pride and fury, now brim with something heavier. You rise instinctively, unsure of what to do, but Hakuin, who has been feeding the child a small bowl of rice porridge, simply looks up, gently wipes the boy's mouth, then places the bowl aside. He stands, lifts the child into his arms, and steps outside. The silence between them is deep, not uncomfortable, just full, like a bowl holding something precious. Then, the father speaks. "Master Hakuin, we have come to apologize." His voice trembles. Words long held back now spill, slow and deliberate. "Our daughter, she has told us the truth." The young woman lifts her gaze, eyes red, lips pressed tight, and nods. "You are not the father." The father continues. "The child's father is a young man from the fish market. She was afraid. We were ashamed, and in our shame, we forced her to say your name." He stops, breath catching. "We are deeply sorry for the false words, for the damage, for the burden we forced upon you. We have come to take the child home, and we will tell the village what really happened." The mother bows low, her forehead nearly to the earth. "Please forgive us." You turn toward Hakuin, heart pounding. What will he say? How will he respond to the confession, the apology, the sudden shift? But he only holds the child close for a moment longer, then gently, slowly, steps forward. He places the child into the arms of the grandfather, and then softly, as if speaking to the wind itself, he says, "Is that so? No anger, no sorrow, no joy, just presence." The grandfather accepts the child, tears welling in his eyes. The mother holds out her hands, reaching. The child, still too young to understand the weight of this moment, giggles at a falling blossom, and the scene holds, like a painting suspended between breaths. Then, with deep bows and whispered thanks, they turn and walk away, this time slowly, reverently, carrying not only the child, but the weight of their own learning. You remain still, unable to move. You want to scream. How can he let go so easily? You want to cry after all this. Doesn't he feel anything? But Hakuin does not turn to you. He returns to his garden, picks up the half-finished bowl of porridge, and begins to clean the empty dish. The sun rises fully now, casting warm gold across the quiet earth. You finally speak, your voice a breath. You cared for him for a whole year, and now he's gone. Hakuin looks up not with sadness, not with serenity, but with a kind of spaciousness that holds both. "Yes," he says, and this time it is not the mantra, not the koan, but simply a fact. He was here, and now he's not. You sit beside him, unsure what to feel. The silence stretches. Finally, you whisper, "Didn't you love him?" And Hakuin smiles. "Of course I did," he says. "That is why I let him go." The words land not as wisdom, but as truth. Not something to learn, but something to remember. He continues, voice barely above the breeze, to love without possession, to give without clinging, to serve without needing to be seen. That is the path. You close your eyes, and in the dark behind your lids, images unfold: a crying infant held in gentle arms, the warmth of midnight lullabies, a monk, falsely accused, holding space for life anyway, and then an open hand, releasing. The freedom in that gesture is blinding. You realize now Hakuin was never trapped, not by the accusation, not by the shame, not even by the love, because his heart was open, but not grasping. He gave fully, but claimed nothing. He served completely, but required no recognition. And in that way, he remained free, not separate from the world, but untouched by its chains. You rise, bow, and walk away slowly toward the village, toward the noise, toward the complicated world beyond the garden. But something in you is different now, not because you've learned something, but because you've witnessed someone live it. 3 words, so light they barely disturb the air, so plain they could be overlooked. Yet, again and again, they return, whispered gently into moments of accusation, misunderstanding, change, and release. Is that so? At first, they seem evasive, maybe even careless, words you might say to deflect responsibility, to avoid truth, to shrug off the weight of life. But when spoken by Hakuin, they carry a different weight, one not of dismissal, but of presence. They do not turn away from life. They turn toward it, but without grasping. You begin to hear the echo of these words in everything. When he was accused unjustly, is that so? When he lost his standing in the village, is that so? When he became the caretaker of a child, not his own, is that so? When the truth emerged, and the child was taken away, is that so? They are not answers. They are space. They are not conclusions. They are openings. Because is that so? is not a statement. It is a practice of not rushing to defend, a practice of letting the world be as it is, without immediately trying to make it different. A practice of allowing truth to reveal itself, not by force, but through time, through stillness, in a world that moves fast, where everyone wants to be right, to be heard, to be justified. These 3 words are a revolution, not the kind that burns and breaks, but the kind that dissolves. They melt away the need to cling, to defend an image, to hold on to being the victim, to seek validation for suffering. They invite you to sit in the eye of the storm and listen, to hear what is beneath the noise, beneath the stories, beneath the self that always wants to explain. Is that so? Does not mean we don't care. It means we are not controlled. It means we no longer need the world to align with our identity in order to feel whole. It means we do not build a fortress of belief and fight to keep it intact. We let the wind pass through. We let the moment be. And in that letting, we find something extraordinary. Freedom. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom from the inner tightening that difficulty often brings. Not freedom from being hurt, but freedom from needing to turn hurt into a weapon. Not freedom from misunderstanding, but freedom from the fear of being misunderstood. It is the kind of freedom that does not depend on the world agreeing with you. And it is that freedom, more than anything, that makes Hakuin untouchable, not because nothing affects him, but because he doesn't cling to what arises. He meets life as it is, not as he demands it to be. And when life changes as it always does, he moves with it, rather than against it, not out of passivity, but from deep clarity, because he knows trying to hold the river still only drowns the one who resists. Is that so? Is his boat light, flexible, able to float through every season, every judgment, every loss? You begin to feel the invitation of these words in your own life. When someone questions your integrity, when plans unravel, when you're blamed unfairly, when something precious is taken, can you breathe? Can you pause? Can you say, not with sarcasm, not with surrender, but with a soft curiosity, is that so? And in that pause, can you feel what remains untouched? The part of you that does not need to react, explain, or control. That part is your original face, the quiet space beneath all roles, names, identities. It is not fragile. It is not rigid. It is just here, and it waits for you. Each time you remember to ask, is that so? Not as a trick, not as a spiritual mask, but as a doorway to return, to rest, to release. Like Hakuin, you may still feel pain, still feel joy, still lose and love and grieve, but you will not be trapped. Because when you meet life with openness, life can no longer own you. The winds may blow, but you are sky. The waves may crash, but you are ocean. The stories may come and go, but you are stillness. And sometimes, all it takes to remember this is 3 simple words. Is that so? There is a certain hunger in modern life, not just for food or comfort, but for affirmation, for validation, for being seen as right, as good, as successful, as enough. We carry our names like banners, our beliefs like shields. We define ourselves through roles, titles, screens full of curated images and carefully chosen words. And yet so easily, it can all unravel. One email, one comment, one look of disapproval, one false accusation, and suddenly, we are spiraling defensive, anxious, desperate to explain, to correct, to reclaim the story about who we think we are. It's exhausting, isn't it? To constantly guard an identity that feels like it might collapse with the slightest misunderstanding in such a world. Hakuin's response, those 3 quiet words, feel not only radical, but healing. Is that so? Imagine, just for a moment, receiving criticism at work. A colleague assumes something false. Rumors start, eyes shift. The silence in meetings grows heavier, and instead of rushing to correct the story, instead of reacting from fear or fury, you pause and breathe. You feel the ache in your chest. Yes, you notice the clenching in your gut, but you do not chase it. You do not drown in it. You meet it, and softly, inwardly, you say, "Is that so?" Not with sarcasm, not with surrender, but with space. The kind of space that allows you to remember this story they are telling about who you are, what you've done, what you mean. It is only a story. It may pass, it may not, but it is not you. And that simple pause might change everything. Or imagine scrolling online. You post something heartfelt. Someone replies with cruelty. You feel the heat rise in your throat. Your fingers itch to type back, to argue, to prove your worth. But instead, you step back. You feel the pull. You breathe. You soften. Is that so? You begin to reclaim a freedom that doesn't depend on anyone's opinion. Because here's the truth. People will misunderstand you. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Not because they are bad, but because they too are tangled in their own fears, their own projections, their own hunger to define the world in black and white. And sometimes, you'll be wrong. You'll make mistakes, say the wrong thing, hurt someone unintentionally. Even then, Is That So can guide you not as a way to escape accountability, but as a way to stay present. Instead of collapsing into guilt or shame, you listen, you reflect, you respond not from panic, but from clarity. This is not passivity. This is responsibility rooted in awareness, not ego. Is That So? Is not a tool to dismiss pain, but to remain steady within it, to respond rather than react, to hold your ground without hardening. It's not easy, especially when the world teaches us to fight for our names, to defend our images, to never let anyone walk all over us. But what if the deepest strength is not in fighting, but in not being shaken? What if dignity lives not in being seen as perfect, but in being whole despite imperfection? What if peace isn't found in being proven right, but in no longer needing to be? Hakuin didn't lose anything when the village turned against him, because he had already let go of the need to be someone. He didn't hold the child out of pride. He held him because there was love to give. And when the child was taken, he let go. Because love, real love, does not cling in a world constantly asking us to prove, defend, and perform. This kind of spaciousness is revolutionary. And yet, it's not about withdrawing from life. It's about showing up fully, without grasping. It's about being present, not to protect a self-image, but to meet the moment, just as it is, and maybe, little by little. We can practice this too. In our relationships, when a partner misunderstands you, and instead of snapping back, you pause. Is that so? In parenting, when your child says, you're unfair, and you want to react, but you breathe. Is that so? In the workplace, when your efforts go unnoticed, and the bitterness rises? Is that so? Not to suppress, not to escape, but to make room for awareness, for stillness, for response born of wisdom, not fear. Over time, you might begin to notice the less you need to be seen a certain way, the freer you become. You lose nothing essential by letting go of control. You only lose the weight you were never meant to carry. So the next time life turns unexpectedly, the next time you are misjudged, or hurt, or thrown into uncertainty, you might return to those 3 soft syllables. You might close your eyes, feel your breath settle, and ask yourself not with resignation, but with presence, is that so? And in that moment, you might remember, you are not the story. You are the space that holds it, and from that space, everything becomes possible again. There is a kind of silence that doesn't just quiet the ears, but hushes the heart. You feel it the moment you step through the gates of the old temple, nestled deep within the pine-covered hills. It stands quietly, as if it has always been there, its roof low and wide like outstretched arms, its wooden beams darkened by time, polished smooth by centuries of wind and prayer. Moss blankets the stone steps. The scent of incense lingers, not heavy, but soft, like breath left behind. This is not a place of spectacle. There are no towering statues or golden relics, no signs proclaiming truths. But something within the silence here draws you in as though the stillness itself is speaking. This is the temple of Teisui. You do not meet him right away. First, you walk through the garden. Pebbles carefully raked into spirals, like ripples echoing outward from an unseen center. Bamboo stalks rustling gently in the breeze. A single bell, hanging from the eaves, chimes as a dragonfly brushes past. It is a place of order, but not the rigid kind. A kind of order that listens to the seasons, that allows imperfection to be part of the design. And in the center of that design, tending quietly to a bed of wild herbs, is Teisui. He is not dressed in ceremonial robes, but in a simple cotton kimono faded with use. His hands are earth-stained, his sleeves are rolled. At first glance, you might mistake him for a gardener, and in a way, you'd be right, because Teisui does not separate spiritual practice from daily life. To him, sweeping the path is no less sacred than meditation. Washing bowls is as holy as chanting. Carrying water is as worthy as carrying wisdom. When you approach, he looks up, not startled, not expectant, simply present. His gaze is quiet, not piercing, not assessing, just there. Like the surface of a lake that reflects without effort. He nods once, then returns to his task. There are no introductions, no questions, no instruction, just the shared rhythm of working side by side. And it's in that rhythm that you begin to feel something shift, not quickly, not dramatically, but subtly, like the warming of cold hands near a fire. Teisui teaches without teaching. He speaks rarely, but when he does, it is like water breaking the surface of stillness. One evening, as the sun dips low behind the hills, you finally ask him, why this place? Why live so simply, so quietly, when you could be elsewhere leading, speaking, writing? He wipes his hands on his robe, then gestures to the garden. Because everything I need to understand, he he says softly, is already happening here. You look around at the moss, the bamboo, the sky deepening into dusk, and something in you softens. Teisui is not a man seeking to be known. He is not a man trying to become anything. He is simply present, fully. And that presence is the lesson. You learn that Teisui once trained in larger temples, under renowned masters, surrounded by hundreds of students and scrolls of wisdom. But over time, something in him began to quiet, not out of disillusionment, but clarity. He realized that true understanding wasn't something added. It was something uncovered, like mist lifting to reveal the mountain that was always there. So he came here not to escape, but to return. Return to what is essential. Return to what is real. And in this return, he became not just a monk, but a mirror, not shining brightly, not drawing attention, but reflecting, gently, the truth that already lives within those who come near him. Villagers speak of him with reverence, but he never claims their praise. Visitors arrive with questions, and often leave without answers, but with peace. He does not answer as expected. He does not explain. But sometimes, in the way he sweeps a fallen leaf or pauses to watch the wind in the trees, something lands, and that something lingers longer than any teaching. You come to see that Teisui is not interested in being followed. He is interested in people learning to follow their own breath, not his voice, but their silence, not his path, but their step. And the temple reflects that. It doesn't dazzle, it doesn't demand, it simply receives. And perhaps that is why you stay. Not because of words, but because of space. The kind of space that reminds you you are not broken. You are simply busy. And in the stillness, you can return. Just like Teisui did. Not to a new truth, but to the one that's been waiting all along. It happens on an ordinary day. The kind of day that slips through your fingers if you're not paying attention. Sunlight filters softly through the pine trees, casting golden shadows across the wooden planks. The scent of cedar hangs in the air, mingling with warm steam that drifts lazily from the temple's communal bathhouse. Teisui is there, as he often is after morning work, his robe folded neatly on a bench, his shoulders bare, his skin lined with the quiet wisdom of time. He moves slowly, dipping a wooden pail into hot water, then pouring it gently over his back. Each movement is unhurried, almost reverent. The bathhouse, though humble, is a place of healing. Stone floors, a deep, soaking tub, silence held like a breath between walls. You're nearby, tending to towels, when the door opens abruptly. A stranger enters young, loud, unfamiliar. His steps echo like shouts. His clothes bear the mark of wealth. But his eyes are restless. He glances at Teisui, scoffs, and mutters just loud enough to cut the quiet. So this is the great master. Looks like just an old man soaking in a tub. A few others hear it. Some glance away, uncomfortable. One chuckles nervously. The stranger smirks, expecting reaction. Teisui does not look up. He pours another pail of water slowly over his shoulders, as if the words had never been spoken. The room shifts. The insult hangs in the steam, unresolved. You freeze, waiting. Will Teisui speak, rebuke, defend? But he does none of these. He reaches for a cloth, begins to scrub his arm with the same slow care, and softly, almost too softly to hear, he murmurs, "Is that so?" The stranger blinks, pauses, then scoffs again, louder this time. A real master would respond. A real monk would have something wise to say. Teisui looks up now. His eyes meet the young man's, not sharp, not challenging, just present. And he nods. "Is that so?" There's no mockery in his voice, no sarcasm, just an opening. But the young man isn't ready for it. He mutters something under his breath and leaves, the door banging closed behind him. Silence returns. The steam softens the edges of the air. Again. You exhale only then, realizing you had been holding your breath. Teisui continues his bath, his shoulders relaxed, his breath even later. As the sun warms the stones outside, you sit beside him on the temple steps. The incident lingers in your mind like ripples on still water. "Weren't you angry?" you ask. Teisui smiles, not with amusement, but with clarity. There was no one to be angry. You frown, but he insulted you. Did he? Teisui replies gently, or did he speak to an idea of who he thought I was? You're silent. He continues, "If I carry no image, no title, no role, then what is there to defend? You think of your own life, how quickly you react when someone questions you, how tightly you hold to your name, your worth, your truth, the way one insult can echo for days inside your mind. But don't words have power, you ask? Yes, he says, but only when we believe them, only when we take them in and build something from them." He picks up a fallen pine needle, holds it between his fingers. "A single word," he says, "is like this needle. It can touch your skin and fall away, or if you press it in, it can wound." He lets the needle go. It drifts to the earth. You watch it settle, undisturbed, and something in you begins to understand. Teisui was not untouched by the insult because he is beyond feeling, but because he no longer needs to build identity around reaction. He knows who he is, and who he is needs no defense. Because when you are not trying to be something, no one can take it from you. The bathhouse moment stays with you, not as drama, but as lesson, a living koan, a reminder that peace does not come from being respected. It comes from being free of needing to be, and that freedom, it begins the moment you, too, are willing to ask, "Is that so?" It begins with water, not in a grand teaching hall, not with a scroll or scripture, but with the simple act of watching water flow from one stone to another in the temple's garden. Teisui stands there one morning, beside the bamboo spout. The rhythm is constant. Water gathers, tips, spills, a soft tapping sound as it strikes the rock below, the kind of sound you'd normally overlook. But Teisui stands still, listening. You watch him from a short distance, unsure if you should speak, but he does not move. Minutes pass, then more. The water flows, taps, echoes. At last, he turns to you and says, quietly, "Can you hear the lesson in that? You listen again? Really listen? The tap of water? The silence in between? The repetition? The patience? It never hurries," he says. "It never fights. It simply flows. And yet, over time, it shapes the hardest stone." You nod slowly. He crouches by the stream and runs his fingers through it. Water doesn't hold its form. He continues. It takes the shape of whatever holds it. Yet, in that softness is power. You begin to see this is not just about water, it's about being. You walk with him later that day through the forest that hugs the temple's edge. He pauses often, not with a plan, but with wonder. A curled leaf, a moss-covered log, the movement of light through bamboo. To most, these things are background scenery, but to Teisui, they are sutras. Every leaf, he says, has known impermanence. It sprouts, grows, falls, becomes soil, but it resists nothing. That's why it dances. Even as it dies, you feel something shift. Not intellectually, but viscerally. You begin to look at everything differently. A pile of stones beside the path. The way they rest, not in order, but in harmony. A bird call high in the trees. The rise and fall of it like breath. Even the wind, its presence invisible, yet undeniable. You cannot hold it. You cannot predict it. And yet, you know when it has passed through you. Teisui's eyes soften when you share this. Yes, he says, the teachings are everywhere, not just in temples, not just in silence, but in life. You realize he is not pointing at metaphors. He's pointing at the truth that lives in plain sight. But we often miss it because we're looking for something louder, more obvious, something that speaks in human language, rather than the language of stillness. Teisui teaches you how to see again, not by changing what you see, but how. One morning, he invites you to sit beside the old stone basin. You sit, you wait. Nothing happens. A few birds call. Wind stirs the trees. A droplet falls into the water. That's all. And after a while, he says, can you notice what doesn't change? You frown. Everything seems to be moving. He smiles. Yes, he says, everything moves, but through it all, there's stillness. You close your eyes. You begin to feel it, not with your mind, but with your breath. There is movement. Yes, but also space. There is sound, but also the silence that cradles it. There is you, watching, and something watching you. You open your eyes and whisper, it's all alive. He nods, and it's all teaching. You begin to carry this vision into your daily life. Washing dishes becomes an act of gratitude. Sweeping leaves becomes a meditation. Drinking tea becomes a moment of reverence. And slowly, you discover nothing is mundane. Everything participates in the great unfolding. The steam rising from your cup, the warmth of the floor beneath your feet, even the crack in the wooden beam, it holds a story of time and pressure and release. Teisui once said, when you stop looking for wisdom, you'll start to see it. And now, you do. Not as something added, but as something uncovered. Water taught you. Stone showed you. Wind reminded you. And the lesson was always the same. Be here. Be soft. Let go of form. Return to flow. Not because life is easy, but because resisting it makes it harder. Not because pain won't come, but because presence allows it to pass through. Not because everything is beautiful, but because everything is whole. Exactly as it is. You look at Teisui now, not as someone above you, but beside you. A fellow witness, a student of the same earth, the same sky, the same flowing water. And in that seeing, you feel free. Not because you know more, but because you need to know less. You have come home not to a place, but to a way of seeing. And in that seeing, everything becomes a path. Transformation doesn't always arrive with a trumpet. Sometimes it walks barefoot, quiet, unannounced. That's how Teisui changed the world around him, not with grand teachings or public declarations, but with how he boiled tea, how he swept the path, how he paused to watch a leaf fall and never rushed it to the ground. You begin to notice it first in small things. The young apprentice who used to rush through chores now moves slower. He no longer sighs while scrubbing the temple floor. Instead, he hums softly, his rhythm more like a ritual than a task. The woman from the village who once came only to complain about her neighbors now comes to sit in silence beside the garden. She says nothing. She just watches the water move, and sometimes smiles. The old carpenter, whose hands trembled with resentment after a lifetime of being ignored, now offers to mend temple steps not for praise, but because it brings him peace to hold wood and make it whole again. No one says Teisui changed them. He never asked them to. He never told anyone what to do. He simply lived as if every moment mattered, as if every breath was an invitation back to presence, as if every action was an act of devotion. And something in that was contagious, not in the way fire burns a forest, but in the way warmth melts frost. You see it in their eyes, a softness that wasn't there before, a patience that rises in tense moments, a willingness to pause before reacting. They begin to ask different questions. Not, how do I get what I want? But, what is this moment asking of me? Not, how do I fix everything but? How do I meet what's here with care? Even the children notice. One day, a boy sits beside Teisui during morning light and asks, "Why don't you talk more?" Teisui smiles and points to the shadow of a tree on the wall. "Do you hear that?" The boy tilts his head. "Listening? I hear nothing." "Exactly," Teisui says. "But that silence is where everything begins." The boy doesn't fully understand, but something lands anyway. Weeks later, when his friend teases him, he doesn't shout back. He just looks at the tree and remembers the shadow. And somehow, that helps. You realize Teisui isn't trying to create followers. He's nurturing freedom, not the loud kind, not the kind that fights and wins, but the quiet freedom of someone who no longer needs to win. The kind that isn't shaken by opinions, that doesn't clutch to identity, that isn't disturbed by whether inside or out. And because he's free, others begin to believe they can be too. One evening, a traveling monk visits the temple. He has questions, so many questions, about doctrine, about awakening, about the right form of meditation. Teisui offers him tea. He pours it slowly. Steam curls upward. The cup is placed gently on the mat. The monk waits. Teisui takes a sip, then another. Finally, the monk asks, "Master, when will you teach me?" Teisui raises the cup. "I am. No lecture, no ceremony, just tea." But in that tea, in that pause, the monk sees something he's never seen before. Not because it wasn't there, but because now he's quiet enough to notice. You begin to see that transformation isn't always visible. Sometimes it's a question someone no longer needs to ask. A grudge someone forgets to carry. A breath taken before a decision. A walk taken without headphones, just to listen to birds. This is Teisui's gift. He doesn't give you answers. He gives you back the part of yourself that doesn't need them. And in that space, life becomes different. Not perfect, not without pain, but spacious, gentle, true. You remember once, watching him lift a heavy pot, his hands slow but steady. You offered to help. He said yes, not because he couldn't do it alone, but because letting you help was also a lesson. Afterward, you asked, why didn't you just say, no, thank you, and finish it yourself? He smiled and replied, because strength is not doing everything alone. It's knowing when to share the weight. That stayed with you. And now, years later, when someone asks if you need help, you say yes more often. Not because you're weak, but because you've learned that shared silence can be stronger than solitary noise. And so the temple changes, the village changes, not through force, but through presence. Through one man who lived each moment as a prayer with no words, no demands, no destination, just this. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that maybe this is enough. There's a bowl in the temple kitchen clay, unglazed, with a small crack near the rim. Teisui uses it every morning, not because it's the finest, not because it's symbolic, but because it's there, and it holds what needs to be held. You once asked him why he never replaced it. He looked at the bowl, touched its edge gently, and said, because this bowl, just like this life, carries what it can, crack and all. That's how he lives with attention, not just to beauty, but to being. You start to see he does nothing carelessly. When he lights incense, it's not a habit, it's an arrival. When he folds a robe, each crease is quiet devotion. When he picks herbs from the garden, he thanks the plant with his silence. There's no rush, no checking off tasks, only presence. And this begins to change you. Not all at once, but like water shaping stone, you find yourself walking slower, not because you're tired, but because you're listening to the gravel under your feet, to the breeze through the trees, to the space between things. One day, you notice how Teisui sweeps the temple path, not just the leaves, but the spaces in between them. He doesn't sweep to make it clean. He sweeps to meet the moment. Each movement of his hand is a kind of blessing. Each breath, a bow. And in that quiet rhythm, you feel it, the presence that doesn't need a purpose. This is the heart of his teaching, that the sacred is not somewhere else, not later, not hidden in mystery. It's here, in the way you pour tea, in the way you greet a stranger, in the way you place your shoes by the door. It's in the pause before you speak, in the breath before you choose, in the soft awareness that you are alive, and that this moment will never return. Teisui never says, be mindful. He simply is. And by being, he invites you into a different pace of life, one where nothing is wasted, not a word, not a crumb, not a single blink of sky. You begin to understand mindfulness is not about control. It's about attention, loving attention, soft attention, the kind that looks at a cracked bowl and sees enough, the kind that hears a child's cry and doesn't shush it, but leans closer, the kind that doesn't try to fix everything, but meets it fully. This is the practice, not in silence alone, not in retreat, but in the exact shape of your day. how you brush your hair, how you wash your face, how you set the table. And in doing so, you begin to return to the part of you that is not hurried, that doesn't measure worth in accomplishments, that doesn't seek approval to feel real. You return to the stillness that watches and accepts even your flaws, even your fears, even your doubt, because the cracked bowl still holds water, and your imperfect life still holds grace. Teisui's greatest teaching was never in his words. It was in how he bowed to the ordinary, and by doing so, made it holy. We live in an age of more choices, more speed, more convenience. Shelves overflow. Notifications never end. Ads whisper that you are just one purchase away from happiness. And yet, the hunger persists. Not a hunger of the body, but of the heart. Because no matter how much we buy, if our attention is absent, nothing feels enough. Teisui never preached against material things. He wore his robe simply because it served its purpose. He used a cracked bowl, not because it was fashionable, but because it was present. He didn't collect objects. He tended to them. There's a difference. One day, you asked him if he ever wanted more. He held up his teacup and said, "More than this, it wasn't a joke. It was a koan." Because in that small chipped cup was stillness, warmth, presence, enough. He once said, "Every time we reach outward for meaning, we forget that the cup is already full." But the modern world teaches otherwise. We're taught to measure ourselves by accumulation. A new phone, a faster car, a better house, more clothes, more apps, more likes. We fill our spaces than our storage units. We shop to soothe stress, scroll to fill silence, consume not just things, but time. And still, a quiet dissatisfaction grows. Teisui would not scold this. He would sit with it. He would notice how much of our wanting isn't really about the item, but about the absence beneath it, the absence of pause, the absence of enoughness, the absence of being here. He would gently ask, "Before you click, can you breathe? Before you buy, can you listen to what you truly need, not with guilt, but with care?" Because at the heart of overconsumption is often a deep ache, the ache to matter, the ache to belong, the ache to feel whole. And no object can fill that space. Only presence can. You begin to shift, not by renouncing everything, but by choosing more consciously. You hold items longer before replacing them. You repair what can be mended. You ask yourself, does this help me return to myself or distract me from myself? You create space not to own less, but to feel more. And slowly, you feel different, not because you lack, but because you begin to sense you were never lacking. You were just lost in the noise. Teisui's way is not about poverty. It's about reverence for things, for moments, for breath. When he sweeps the floor, it's not just to clean, it's to greet the earth again. When he cooks rice, it's not just to eat, it's to honor what was grown. This mindset transforms everything. It turns consumption into connection. It turns ownership into stewardship. It turns mine into this, for now, and in that subtle shift, freedom is born. Freedom from needing more to be okay. Freedom from chasing the next. Freedom to be enough. Now, here, with this, you may still live in a city, still have a job, still own things, but your relationship with them softens. You begin to ask, am I using this, or is it using me? You begin to feel the weight of too much, not in guilt, but in gravity. And you learn to let go. Not everything at once, just one thing. A shirt you don't wear, a digital subscription, a reflex to check your phone when silence arrives. You replace it with a breath, a walk, a pause, a sip of tea in a chipped cup. And in that sip, you remember Teisui, not because he told you what to do, but because he showed you what's possible. A life, not of less, but of more meaning. And suddenly, that is worth everything. The mountains held the temple like a secret, tucked among ancient cedars and shrouded in mist. It stood not to declare, but to receive. Its roof lines blended with the clouds. Its stones had long forgotten their first placement, and its silence stretched beyond sound. This was the home of Basui, a Zen master known not for his words, but for his presence. To some, he seemed stern; to others, luminous. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his voice carried like wind over water, gentle, but undeniable. He lived simply, wore his robes until they frayed, ate what was given, slept where the floor allowed, and each morning, he bowed to the sky as though thanking it for still being there. Those who sought him didn't come for comfort. They came for truth, and they found it not in teachings, but in how he sat still in the face of storms. Among his disciples was a young man named Soren, not the strongest, not the loudest, but steady. He asked few questions, but listened with his whole being. His eyes always carried a weight as if he'd seen both sorrow and grace, and learned not to cling to either. One winter, Soren fell ill. At first, it seemed like a passing fever. He continued his morning chants, still tended the stones in the temple path, but slowly. His steps grew slower, his breath thinner. The fire in his eyes dimmed, not in spirit, but in body. Basui noticed. He didn't speak of it. He simply adjusted. He placed Soren's mat closer to the sunlit side of the hall. He poured tea without being asked. He paused longer in the evenings, sitting quietly nearby, not to console, but to be. One night, as snow fell outside and the world hushed itself to sleep, Soren looked at Basui and asked the question he had long carried. "Master, what happens when I die?" Basui didn't answer right away. He looked at the flame of the oil lamp, watched it flicker. Then he said, "Don't ask what happens when you die. Ask, who is it that dies?" Soren closed his eyes, and silence returned, not as an absence, but as a companion. In the days that followed, the illness grew. Soren could no longer sit for long. His hands trembled. The sound of wind in the eaves seemed to speak more clearly than words. And yet, peace deepened around him, because in that time, slow, stripped of activity, he met the teachings not in books, but in breath. He watched the way the steam from his tea rose and vanished. He listened to his own heart, its pulse a quiet drum fading into the infinite. He no longer asked to be cured. He asked to be present. And Basui, each day, simply came and sat, not as master and student, but as presence meeting presence. Sometimes they said nothing. Sometimes Basui read to him just a line or two, a single verse, a question left hanging like a bell's final tone. One morning, Soren whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore. Basui looked at him. Of what? Of disappearing. Basui smiled. You never were what disappears. And Soren wept, not out of sorrow but from recognition. The snow outside had melted. The earth softened. And in the quiet breath between two words, something opened. The teacher and the dying student sat side by side, not clinging to life, not rejecting death, just being. And in that being, they were free. The room was dim. Outside, the wind passed through bare branches, whispering like monks reciting sutras without words. Inside, the oil lamp flickered gently, its flame swaying with the quiet breath of winter. Basui sat cross-legged, a blank sheet before him. He had written many things in his life verses, instructions, reflections, but tonight felt different. This letter was not for a crowd, not for teaching beyond time. It was for Soren, for a soul nearing the edge of form. He dipped the brush in ink, paused, then began, if you wish to know the undying, unborn essence of mind, turn inward and gaze into the source of your own breath. The ink flowed like water. Each stroke was stillness, each word a window. You are not this body that weakens. You are not the thoughts that rise and fall. You are not the fear that visits in the dark. Outside, the snow began again. Inside, Basui continued, there is something in you that was never born and cannot die. He remembered the look in Soren's eyes, days before, a flicker of peace, deeper than understanding. That moment when, in silence, the student had recognized what no word could hold. But still, Basui wrote, not to explain, but to leave a trace of clarity, like footsteps in fresh snow, for Soren to follow when the mind grew clouded. The body is like a dewdrop clinging to a leaf. He wrote, it sparkles briefly, then falls, but the dew is not lost. It returns to the vastness from which it came. His brush paused. He inhaled, long, deep, a breath like a bell, then continued, do not cling to form. Do not fear formlessness. You are not the dew. You are the water itself. The teaching was not new. Masters had spoken it for centuries. But tonight, it was not philosophy. It was medicine. And like all medicine, it had to meet the patient where they were. So Basui kept writing, not with scholarly precision, but with love. When breath leaves the body, do not chase it. When the heart slows, do not panic. Stay with awareness. That which sees all this remains untouched. He remembered his own teacher, many years ago, whispering, the true self has no face, but sees all, has no name, but answers every call. He smiled softly, dipped the brush again. There is a sky in you, Soren, beneath the storm. Look there. He didn't write in order. He wrote as breath moved, sometimes pausing to sip tea, sometimes closing his eyes to listen not to the mind, but to the silence beneath it. There is no death for that which was never born, and your true nature was never born. Each line, he read aloud, not for clarity, but for resonance. If fear comes, bow to it. If sadness comes, welcome it. But remember you are the host. They are only visitors. He could see Soren's face in his mind calm now, even in pain, not struggling, not resisting, just being. And that, more than any teaching, was the lesson. You are not the wave, he wrote, but the ocean. At last, when the page was full, he set the brush down. He rolled the letter slowly, tied it with a thread of hemp, and he bowed to it not as paper, but as offering. When he handed it to Soren the next morning, neither spoke, but their eyes met, and Soren understood. He did not need to read it all at once. Sometimes he would take a single sentence, hold it like a pebble in his palm, and sit with it for hours. "There is something in you," he whispered once, "that was never born," and tears welled, not of sorrow, but of remembering, not of parting, but of returning. As days passed, his body weakened further, but something else grew clearer, like fog lifting from a mountain, revealing what had always been. He no longer asked what would happen. He simply watched. One night, he clutched the letter to his chest and smiled. "There is no death," he murmured, "only forgetting." And then, quiet. Basui sat beside him long after, not mourning, but bowing to the body that had served, to the mind that had awakened, to the truth that had never left. Outside, the wind stirred the bamboo. Inside, the lamp flickered once more, and the letter ink dried. Words still lay beside a still heart, now returned to its source, not lost, not gone, just home. The final morning arrived without warning. No sign, no storm, just stillness. Soren lay quietly, his breath now light barely touching the surface of air, his face pale, yet calm, not gripped by struggle, not dragged by fear, just soft, like mist dissolving into the morning sky. You were there, watching, sitting, Basui beside him, silent, no chanting, no ceremony, only presence. A candle flickered in the corner, its flame swaying gently as if mirroring Soren's final breaths. One breath in, one breath out, and then no more, no gasp, no cry, no clinging, just the deep stillness of a body that had fulfilled its course. The room did not darken. It brightened, because in that silence, you felt it not an ending, but a return. The return of a wave to the sea, the return of a breath to the wind. Basui did not weep. He placed his hand gently over Soren's heart, bowed, and whispered, "You are free." You sat long after, not in grief, but in reverence. You felt the mystery more deeply than ever before, how something could be here one moment and gone the next, and yet not gone. Because what Soren had touched in his final days was not something that died. It was something that was never born. You remembered Basui's letter. There is no death for that which was never born. And now, you understood, not as a concept, but as truth. In the days that followed, the temple did not mourn in the usual sense. No loud cries, no black robes of sorrow, only quiet hands preparing the body, only gentle footsteps carrying water, only the sound of wind through cedar offering its own prayer. Soren was returned to the earth with tenderness, his ashes placed beneath a young pine tree, roots barely touching memory. Basui spoke only once. Let the body return. Let the spirit expand. Let the teaching continue. You thought then of impermanence not as loss, but as rhythm, not as something to fear, but to honor, because everything changes, but not everything disappears. The cherry blossoms still fell each spring. The sun still touched the temple stones with warmth. The birds still sang at dawn. And Soren, he was there, in the silence between footsteps, in the breath before a bow. In the soft stillness that settled over the garden at dusk, you began to feel impermanence differently, not like a thief, but like a gentle reminder, a bell that rings to wake you up not to endings, but to now, to the preciousness of what is here. The cup of tea held with both hands, the hand that lingers on your shoulder before parting, the breath that rises and falls, not to keep it, but to cherish it. Soren's passing became your teacher. He showed that dying is not the worst thing. Forgetting who we are is, and remembering, that's the miracle. That's the gift. You no longer feared impermanence. You bowed to it. You made peace with the wave. You trusted the sea. And in that trust, something in you relaxed. The tightness around control, the panic and uncertainty, the need to hold, all softened because you really saw that nothing stays. And that's okay, because what matters was never meant to stay. It was meant to be met, fully, lovingly, and then released, like a breath, like a friend, like a life. This was Soren's gift, and Basui's. And now, it was yours to carry, not as a burden, but as a blessing. So when the next goodbye came days, months, years later, you were ready. You held the hand, you felt the tremble, and you whispered, just as Basui had, "You are free." And in that moment, so were you. After Soren's passing, the silence deepened not only in the temple halls, but within you. It wasn't grief alone that filled you, but a stillness seeded by something far greater than loss. You had seen death, not as horror, but as release, not as end, but as return. And now, you could no longer look at your life the same. Each morning, you sat a little longer, not because it was expected, but because something within you, longed to meet itself. The questions that once preoccupied your thoughts, am I good enough? Am I doing this right? Will I awaken one day? Now seem to fall away like leaves from a branch. You no longer needed answers. You needed honesty. One morning, while sweeping the path Soren once cared for, you paused, the broom in your hands, the dust rising with each stroke, and suddenly, your breath caught not in fear, but in awareness. This dust, this movement, this light touching the stones, it was all fleeting, and yet entirely enough. That day, you sat beside the same pine tree where Soren's ashes rested. You placed your palm on the ground and quietly asked, what part of me still clings to what will pass? It wasn't a dramatic moment, just quiet, just true. You began to see your habits, how much of your striving came from fear, how often you chased approval disguised as discipline, how you mistook effort for awakening. And you remembered Basui's words, the true self was never born. If that was true, then who was it that worried, that chased, that doubted? And if that self was not you, then perhaps you could let it go. Not violently, not all at once, but gently, like letting go of breath. And in that soft release, something began to shift. You smiled more easily, not because life was easier, but because you no longer needed it to be different. You listened more deeply to wind, to footsteps, to silence. You didn't speak of your insights, because you understood now. The deepest truths don't need to be shared. They need to be lived. And so you swept the path with care, folded your robes slowly, bowed with your whole body, not as performance, but as prayer. One evening, while washing bowls, another disciple asked you, "Do you miss him?" You nodded, but then said, "He's not gone." The disciple looked puzzled. You smiled. "He's here," you said, touching your chest. "Every time I breathe with presence. Every time I stop reaching. Every time I return to what is." That night, under a sky brushed with stars, you sat alone. No teacher beside you. No questions. Just breath. Just this. And from within that stillness, a quiet voice not heard, but felt rose and whispered, "You are already home." You did not chase that feeling. You let it be. And slowly, over the days and months to come, you began to live from that place. Not always, but more often, until even the smallest things, the creak of the floor, the warmth of a bowl of rice, the flicker of a candle, became your temple. And the teachings, they were no longer outside you. They were you. Not perfect, but present. Not special, but sacred. And that, you realized, was enough. The world outside the temple had not changed. Streets still buzzed. People still rushed. Worries still dressed in deadlines. But something in you was different. You returned to the city not as someone who had escaped, but as someone who had remembered. And now, every moment became a field for practice. At first, it wasn't easy. The noise of crowds, the pull of screens, the constant invitation to forget. But you carried with you a question planted deep, like a seed. If I am not this body, not these thoughts, then what am I? And from that space, you began to respond, not with words, but with awareness. In the middle of a traffic jam, you noticed your breath. In the middle of a difficult conversation, you listened not just to words, but to your own reactions. You saw the rising fear of being wrong, of being judged, of losing control. But you didn't run. You watched. And in watching, it softened. You remembered Soren's face in his final days, how even in weakness, there was peace, because he had stopped resisting what was. So you began to try, not to control everything, but to be with everything, to let the moment arrive, to let it pass, to remain, like sky. That shift, small, quiet, began to ripple outward. You met anger with stillness, not because you were suppressing, but because you no longer took it personally. You met grief with openness, not to fix it, but to hold it, like rain in open palms. You began to hear what wasn't said, the loneliness in a friend's eyes, the fatigue behind someone's smile, the child in you, still waiting to be seen. And each time, you returned to that knowing, I am not this reaction. I am not this fear. I am something vast, silent, and free. You didn't always succeed. Sometimes you fell back into old habits. But now, even your falling became part of the path. You no longer judged the stumble. You bowed to it. Because even in forgetting, there was the chance to remember. You brought this seeing into work. Deadlines no longer defined your worth. Emails no longer stole your peace. You did what needed doing, but without the inner tightness. You showed up with presence, and people noticed. They didn't know what had changed, but they felt safer around you, less rushed, more heard, because in your stillness, they found space to be. One day, a colleague asked you, "Why don't things seem to shake you anymore?" You smiled. They still do. You said, "I just don't cling to the shaking." You shared nothing more, because words can only point, and what you had touched lived in the silence behind them. You brought this presence into your home, into the way you cooked rice, into the way you folded clothes, into the way you greeted the mirror, not searching for perfection, but meeting what was there with gentleness. Even your inner critic, once so loud, began to quiet, not because you silenced it, but because you stopped believing it was you. You whispered to it, "Thank you. I see you, but I am not your voice." And it faded. The realization that you were never born and will never die didn't make you passive. It made you brave. Because if you are not this body, then you can show up with full presence, unafraid of loss. If you are not your fears, then you can love more freely, even knowing love may one day end. And if you are not this ego, then you can live each moment not as performance, but as prayer. That's what life became, a practice, not of getting somewhere, but of returning to this breath, this touch, this sound, this being. And in that return, joy rose, quietly, unexpectedly, not the joy of excitement, but the joy of enough. One afternoon, you sat in a park, birds above, children playing, wind in your hair. You closed your eyes and whispered, "I am here," and that is everything. No one around you noticed, but in that moment, you were free. When everything has been said, when stories have been shared, when silence has done its healing work, what remains? A question, or many, not to be answered, but to be lived. As you walk the path Soren once walked, as you sit beneath the tree where his ashes rest, as you watch the sky fold light into dusk, you feel the quiet return of wonder, not the kind that seeks control, but the kind that bows before mystery, and from that stillness, questions rise, not to disturb, but to awaken. What is it that truly dies? Is it the body that decays, the name that fades, the memories that drift like fog? Or is it only the illusion that we were ever separate to begin with? If I was not born in form, then who am I now? Not in roles, not in tasks, but in truth. Who is it that watches? Who is it that grieves? Who is it that dreams? And if that watcher was never touched by time, then is anything ever lost? When I say I am afraid to die, what am I clinging to? A body? An identity? A storyline unfinished? What if death is not an enemy, but a doorway? What if it is not the end, but the exhale before another inhale? Would I live differently if I remembered I will die? Would I love more freely, speak more gently, pause more often? If nothing is certain, then why not be kind? If all things pass, then what is worth holding? What is worth releasing? And in that release, what arises? When I look at a dying leaf, do I see death, or do I see change when I look in the mirror? Do I seek youth, or do I seek presence when I feel sorrow? Do I reject it, or do I welcome it as part of the great turning? If I have one breath left, who will I give it to? And if I have one moment to remember, will it be the applause or the silence that held me? What is this breath, this now, this awareness? And if I do not answer, but only listen. Is that enough? What if enlightenment is not escape, but embrace? Not a place beyond this life, but a way to fully be in it. What if the purpose of life is not to transcend it, but to live it so fully that there's nothing left to hold? Would I still fear endings, or would I bow to them as I bow to beginnings? What if the self I protect so fiercely was never truly me, and the love I seek outside has been inside all along? Would I still run, or would I finally rest? These are not questions to finish. They are invitations to live, to wonder, to remember, not with answers, but with awareness. You carry them now, as one carries fire in a quiet forest, not to burn, but to warm. And in that warmth, you are home. Jun had always lived in silence, not the silence of absence, but of intention. He chose a monastery nestled against forested hills, where fog moved like a second breath and the morning bell was softer than birdsong. Here, he built a life not to be seen, but to see deeply, clearly, without distraction. Each day was the same. Before dawn, he rose, lit incense, bowed to the morning stillness. He swept stone paths, not to remove leaves, but to stay awake. He taught his students not with theory, but by example, how to listen with their whole body, how to bow not just with the spine, but with the heart, how to sit without striving. Jun was respected, even revered. Visitors called him still as the mountain, clear as water, a man who no longer struggles, but inside, something stirred, a quiet echo of a name he never spoke aloud, a small thread of sorrow he never let unravel. He carried it like a pebble in his robe light, yet always present. No one knew, because Jun had mastered the art of stillness. Even pain he held in ceremony, even longing he met with breath. But late at night, when the wind slipped through the temple eaves and the moon spilled into his empty room, his mind would drift not to scriptures, but to a face, a friend, a brother, someone from the world before vows and incense, before robes and rituals, before silence became armor. They had trained together once, in a different temple, under the same teacher. They had laughed, questioned, sat long hours in aching stillness. They had shared mischief and meaning, doubt and devotion. But then distance, not from anger, but from life. Paths diverged, letters stopped, and still, Jun remembered, not out of regret, but out of love not yet bowed to. He often told himself, this is the way of things. And he returned to his duties, helping students untangle their thoughts, tending the sick, teaching by being. But the question lingered, not of what had happened, but of what had not been said. He thought of writing, many times. But words, once withheld too long, grow heavy, and so he remained, silent, until the day the letter came, a folded envelope, stained slightly by travel, no name on the front, just a familiar seal. His breath caught, not out of fear, but recognition. He didn't open it right away. He placed it on the altar, lit incense, bowed, and sat, like he had every morning of his life. But this time, his heart beat louder than the bell. For in that envelope, light as it was rested, something heavier than memory. It held the turning, not of fate, but of self. And as the smoke rose in spirals, Jun whispered not to anyone, but to the silence that had always listened, I am ready. The letter smelled faintly of herbs, dried chrysanthemum, or maybe the green tea his mother always favored on rainy days. Jun's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. It had been many years since he had seen her handwriting, yet each stroke was unmistakable firm, round, gently pressed with quiet care. She had always written as she spoke simply, without embellishment, but with a presence that stayed long after the last word. My dear Jun, the letter began. I suppose I should call you something more proper, reverend, or master, or one who has seen the path. But to me, you will always be Jun, the boy who used to sit by the fire and ask too many questions, the one who wept when the old cat died, the child who wanted to understand everything. Jun exhaled, eyes softening. I know it's been many years since I've written, she continued, and I'm not writing now to ask anything of you, only to remind you of something. A pause. Jun could almost hear her voice in the spaces between the sentences. You've always loved words, she said. I remember when you copied entire sutras into your notebooks as a child. You didn't even understand them then. You just liked the shape of them. You liked how they promised something. Jun smiled, the memory rushing back the way he once thought enlightenment could be earned, page by page. But my dear, the letter continued, don't become a walking dictionary. The words landed like a bell struck softly, yet deeply. You know so much, she wrote. I've heard from those who visit your temple. They say your talks are profound, that you speak like a river, endless, clear, that people sit for hours, hanging on your every word. Jun shifted slightly. His hand trembled. I'm proud of you, the letter said, but also a little worried. She never wasted words. I worry that you're forgetting something. She said, something simple, something your father used to say to you when you were small, when you tried to impress him with names of stars or long chants you had memorized. Jun closed his eyes. He could hear it now. His father's voice, low, warm. Jun, my boy, don't just know the name of the flower. Smell it. His mother continued. Don't become someone who knows everything about the moon, but forgets to go outside and look at it. Jun's throat tightened. You've built a beautiful life, she said. But I wonder, is it still yours? The paper rustled in his hand. Do you sit with your students, or above them? Do you walk barefoot on the earth, or only on rules? Do you still cry at the sound of temple bells? At dusk, Jun's eyes blurred. I don't mean to offend, she added, only to ask, because I see so many men, especially wise ones, especially kind ones, who carry the whole world in their heads and forget they have a body, forget they have a heart that can break. Jun thought of the morning rituals, the chanting, the lectures. Had he drifted? Had he become hollow in the name of holiness? Dear Jun, the letter said, this life isn't about knowing everything. It's about touching something real. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Jun folded the letter slowly, then sat, longer than usual. He didn't chant. He didn't analyze. He just breathed. And for the first time in many years, he didn't try to understand anything. He tried to feel. And in that breath, shallow, honest, unguarded, he realized he had forgotten the smell of chrysanthemum tea. He had forgotten the warmth of his father's hand. He had forgotten what it felt like to weep, not for enlightenment, but for love. He wasn't ashamed, only human. And in that moment, he bowed, not as a teacher, not as a monk, but as a son, as a man, as someone still learning how to live. And somewhere, far away, perhaps near a kitchen window lined with small plants, a mother folded her hands and smiled. The next morning, Jun did something he hadn't done in years. He walked barefoot, across the stone courtyard, across the garden path still damp with dew. The air was crisp, biting at his soles, but he didn't withdraw. He let it in fully, as if his feet, after all this time, had something to remember. He walked slowly, not with purpose, but with presence, and each step echoed his mother's words, "Touch something real." At breakfast, he did not speak, not because he was withholding, but because he was listening to the sound of rice being served, to the breath of the young monk beside him, to the gentle clink of chopsticks against wood. Later, in the Dharma hall, Jun stood before his students, dozens of faces, eyes bright, notebooks ready. He looked at them for a long time, then said, softly, "Today, I have nothing to teach." Murmurs rippled. Jun smiled. "Because today, I realized I've been speaking too much and living too little." No one moved. One student raised a hand. "Master, are you unwell?" Jun shook his head. "For the first time in many years, I might be well." He sat on the edge of the platform, feet dangling like a child's. "My mother wrote to me," he said. "She told me not to become a walking dictionary." A few students chuckled. I did not laugh. Jun said, "I wept." The room hushed again. She reminded me that knowing the name of the flower is not the same as smelling it. And in those words, something cracked open, not just in June, but in the room itself, not because the teaching was new, but because it was real. He told them how he used to recite sutras without feeling, how he hid behind precision, how he feared the messiness of not knowing, and how, now, he was ready to be touched again, to see the moon, he whispered, not just talk about it. The days that followed were different. He canceled several talks. He spent hours in the garden. He cooked with the younger monks, learning again how to peel ginger with care. He cried when the first snow fell, not for any reason, just because it was beautiful. He began writing letters, not lectures, not long essays of thought, but short notes, gentle reminders, like let the bowl be chipped, bow with your breath, not just your body, touch the teacup as if it were alive. His students noticed. He seemed lighter, less like a mountain, more like a stream. Not because he was less wise, but because his wisdom had begun to breathe. He began asking his students more questions, not to test them, but to hear their hearts. What do you see in the flame? What breaks your heart open? When was the last time you were truly here? They didn't always have answers, but they always had stillness afterward. One night, a student sat beside him under the temple lanterns and asked, "Master, what changed you?" Jun smiled. "A letter," he said, "and a voice that remembered me before I forgot myself." The student tilted his head. Jun placed a hand over his own chest. "She reminded me that I was a child before I became a monk." And in that, 1,000 teachings dissolved, leaving only one: be real, be here, be free. And Jun, now older, with fewer words and a fuller heart, walked the path of not knowing with more courage than ever before. The seasons began to change, but this time, so did Jun. It wasn't sudden. No lightning bolt, no loud announcement, just a quiet loosening, like snow melting under steady sun. He still wore his robe, still bowed at dawn, still swept the temple stones. But those around him sensed it. He had stopped quoting. He had started listening. Students who once came to study his words now stayed to feel his silence. He smiled more, cried more, once, during a meal. He laughed at a joke a young monk told, a belly laugh so full and unrestrained that half the room went silent. No one had heard Jun laugh like that before. Afterwards, a novice approached him and said, "Master, you feel different." Jun looked at him and replied, "I am learning to feel, too." And in that answer, 1,000 pages unwritten. He no longer clung to his position. The senior monks, at first, were confused, then concerned. "You're withdrawing from instruction?" they asked. "No," Jun replied. "I'm stepping closer to life." They frowned. He didn't argue. He only bowed. A few weeks later, he declined an invitation to a major Dharma conference one he had attended annually for over a decade. He told them, gently, "There is a lotus blooming behind the temple. I've never watched open. I want to be there when it does." The message puzzled them, but Jun no longer sought to be understood. He sought to be, one by one. He released duties, not from fatigue, but from ripening. He passed the morning chants to a younger monk with a softer voice. He gave his well-worn sutra texts to students who read them with fresh eyes. And then, he began walking more, alone, through nearby villages, along riverbanks, into forests where no one called him master. There, he knelt before wildflowers and remembered their names not in Sanskrit, but in scent. He shared meals with farmers, sat in silence beside sick children, held hands with widows, and said nothing. He wasn't there to teach. He was there to witness. And in witnessing, he felt whole. One evening, as he sat beneath an old pine tree, a memory returned. His first day at the monastery, the fear in his chest, the hunger in his eyes for knowledge, for certainty, for the kind of peace that only books promised. He saw that boy now, with tenderness, not regret. He had needed the books. He had needed the path of discipline, the scaffolding of ideas, the reverence for form. But now, the scaffolding could fall, and the sky would still hold. So, one morning, without fanfare, Jun packed his things. Not many. A robe, a bowl, his mother's letter, and he left the monastery not in defiance, but in devotion. He walked miles and days, sometimes sleeping under trees, sometimes invited into homes where his silence was prayer enough. People asked him who he was. He said, "A traveler." They asked what he was seeking. He said, "Nothing." They asked what he had learned in all his years of study. And he smiled, then whispered, "How to hold a cup of water without spilling." That became his new temple. Not marble halls, but kitchens. Not scriptures, but stories. Not sermons, but smiles. He began writing again, not books, but notes left under stones, messages carved into bark, whispers given to wind. You are enough. Even when you forget, your breath is older than your name. Let go. The ground is still beneath you. And wherever he went, he didn't try to change the world. He simply met it fully, and in doing so, he was changed. The scholar had become the stream. The monk had become the man. The teacher had become the student again. And in that becoming, he was free. Jun now lived in a small hut at the edge of a quiet village. No gate, no altar, just a wooden door, a sleeping mat, and a window that faced the morning sun. Each day began not with a bell, but with birdsong. He no longer bowed to statues. He bowed to steam rising from a pot of rice, to the child who waved from across the dirt path, to the worn soles of his own sandals. Life had become simple, and in that simplicity, he began to truly live. He planted vegetable, not as meditation, not of our metaphor, but to eat, to care, to be present with soil and sprout in season. Neighbors came, slowly, shyly, at first, out of curiosity, then, out of need. Jun didn't preach, he listened. To the grocer's grief, to the widow's loneliness, to the child's story of a broken toy. Sometimes he said nothing. Sometimes he asked a single question. Where do you feel that? In your body. And people cried. Not because they were hurt, but because they had been seen. Jun didn't claim to heal, but somehow, being near him, things softened. One farmer said, "He speaks like rain." Another, "He reminds me to breathe." And Jun, hearing this, would only smile. He didn't try to be anything. He had stopped trying, and in that stopping, he had become. At night, he would sit by the door, watching the stars rise. He no longer sought the answers. He let the sky be vast. Sometimes, he thought of his former students, of scrolls and chants, of his own voice echoing in marble halls, and he whispered, gently, "Let it go." He had no need to return, because what he was searching for then, he had found now, not outside, not above, but in the silence that waited beneath everything. He noticed more, the way light moved across cracked wood, the hush of dawn before the first rooster, the warmth in his chest when a stranger said, "Thank you." His thoughts, once sharp, had softened. His pride, once hidden, had loosened. Even his name felt less important. One evening, a child asked, "Are you a monk?" Jun paused, then said, "I'm someone who loves being quiet." And that, somehow, felt more true than any title ever had. His transformation wasn't grand. It was gentle, like water, shaping stone, like wind shaping breath. Inside, he felt a clarity he'd never known, not the clarity of logic, but of love. Not the kind that explains, but the kind that includes everything: joy, sorrow, noise, stillness. He didn't become enlightened, he became real. And in that reality, he became whole. There was a time when Jun believed knowledge was everything. He pursued it like a flame in the dark. Pages, scrolls, doctrines, names of the ancients, mapped in his mind like constellations, the logic of teachings, the perfection of structure. He recited the Heart Sutra by age 12. He knew the Vinaya rules like the lines on his palm. He spoke with clarity that silenced rooms. People called him wise. He felt proud. But somewhere along the path, the pages grew heavy. They didn't breathe, and though his mind expanded, his chest tightened. Years later, as he sat on a worn bench outside his modest hut, a breeze brushed his cheek and carried with it the scent of jasmine. That single breath taught him more than a dozen commentaries. It wasn't that the teachings were wrong. They were simply incomplete without experience. Words were maps, but maps are not mountains. You cannot eat a recipe. You must taste the fruit. Jun's days became his study. Chopping firewood was his koan. The aching in his knees during long walks taught him impermanence better than any lecture. The way an old woman smiled through missing teeth taught him equanimity. One afternoon, as he helped a neighbor bury a beloved dog, he felt grief rise in his chest, raw, unformed, and instead of naming it, he let it be. Not as a monk, but as a man. And it passed through him like wind through leaves. No theory, no quote, just presence. Later, as he sipped tea beneath an old willow, he whispered, "Now I understand." Not because he had found the answer, but because he had stopped asking the wrong question. He no longer sought to define life. He sought to meet it, to bow to it, to be humbled by it. He realized the most profound things in life came not through mastery, but through surrender, not through accumulation, but through letting go. He remembered a line from long ago. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Now, it rang true, not his poetry, but his breath. A neighbor once asked him, "How did you learn to be so peaceful?" Jun looked at the man's calloused hands, at the sweat on his brow from tilling earth, and said, "By forgetting everything I thought I knew," then added, "and by watching people like you." The man laughed, not understanding. Jun laughed too, because understanding no longer mattered. What mattered was presence. He began to see that even those without teachings often lived the teachings best. The mother who calmed her child with a soft touch, the farmer who knew when to plant by watching the sky, the child who cried freely, then laughed 5 minutes later. These were his new sutras. These were the scriptures written not in ink, but in living. And so Jun stopped seeking to teach. He simply shared what he loved. He pointed to the moon, then walked away. He held space for people to feel without naming. He met sorrow with silence, not solutions. And in doing so, he gave others permission to stop pretending, to be messy, to be human, to be whole. His days were no longer filled with answers, but with wonder. Not, what is the nature of mind, but how does this bread feel in my hands? Not, what is liberation, but can I love this moment exactly as it is? He no longer measured time by tasks, but by tenderness, by the warmth in a shared bowl of soup, by the hush between words, by the ache that reminded him he was still alive. And slowly, gently, his relationship with knowledge transformed. He didn't discard it. He bowed to it. But like fire, he no longer clutched it barehanded. He used it to light small lamps on dark paths. Then, let it go. Because he knew a lamp is helpful in the dark. But at dawn, you don't stare at the lamp. You look at the light. And Jun was walking toward the light, with no book in hand, but with open palms, and in those palms, the full weight of living. In today's world, knowledge is abundant. Degrees hang on walls. Books fill shelves. Information lives in our pockets ready at a tap. We know the brain like never before. We map emotions. We quote philosophers. We track meditation on apps. And yet, many feel empty, restless, cut off from something essential, not because they lack knowledge, but because they have forgotten to feel, to live, to be. Jun's story mirrors this silent crisis. He once lived surrounded by knowledge, honored for it, but knowledge, without contact with life, becomes a shell. So many modern scholars stand at this crossroads. Brilliant minds, busy lives, but hearts tired, eyes glazed, bodies disconnected from breath. They speak of love, yet fear intimacy. They teach mindfulness, yet skip meals to finish deadlines. They explain compassion, yet rush past the lonely janitor each evening. Not out of malice, but out of momentum. And in that rush, they miss the essence, the child's laughter, the softness of rain, the pulse of their own heartbeat. They quote ancient texts about being here now, but rarely feel the moment land. So what happened? When did knowledge stop serving life and start replacing it? Perhaps the mind, in its brilliance, forgot its place not as master, but as companion. Perhaps we mistook clarity for peace, precision for wisdom, achievement for understanding. But true wisdom is not in answers. It's in attention, in the way you sip tea without rushing, in the way you sit with grief not to fix it, but to honor it, in the way you let silence speak, louder than theory. This doesn't mean abandoning study. It means grounding it, making it breathe. So that knowledge becomes food, not armor. So that learning becomes love, not performance. Jun walked away, not because he despised knowledge, but because he needed to remember its purpose. To connect, to touch, to humble. Modern scholars, too, can walk not away from learning, but toward wholeness, toward balance, toward lives where thoughts don't crowd out experience, where books don't silence the body, where silence itself becomes a kind of study. Imagine a world where professors meditate with their students, not just to demonstrate, but to feel together, where therapists pause to breathe before sessions, not as routine, but as reverence, where researchers step into nature not to analyze, but to bow. In such a world, learning would not only inform, it would transform. Not only impress, but embrace. The scholar would not stand above life. Describing it, they would kneel within it, living it, like Jun, like the stream. And in doing so, perhaps they'd remember that knowing something is not the same as being with it, and that sometimes the wisest thing we can do is to listen. It happened in a quiet village at the edge of misty hills, the kind of place where roosters woke the dawn, where incense curled through temple halls, and where the villagers bowed to the Buddha, not just with their bodies, but with their whole lives. At the center of the village stood an old temple, and inside that temple stood a statue tall, carved from stone the color of pale moonlight. The Buddha sat in lotus, eyes half closed in knowing, a soft smile carved into eternity. For generations, this statue had never been touched. Until one day, it began with a gasp. The caretaker, arriving to sweep the temple floor, dropped his broom. There, on the Buddha's nose, was a black dot, small, perfectly round, as if placed by a single stroke of ink. Panic spread quickly. The villagers rushed to see. They came with offerings of rice, of lotus, of questions. Who had done this? Was it a child? A madman? A heretic? No one knew. The priest was summoned. He examined the mark with trembling fingers, tried to wipe it, scrub it, pray it away, but it remained, and soon, anger grew. "This is desecration," one cried. "An insult," said another. "We must catch him," said a third. And so they did. By dusk, a man was found sitting quietly outside the village well, middle-aged, plain robes, calloused hands. Someone had seen him near the temple. He didn't deny it. "You did this?" the priest asked, holding up a finger stained with ink. The man nodded. Why the villagers cried. "Why defile what is sacred?" The man smiled, gently, then said, "So you would finally look." A silence fell. "What do you mean?" someone whispered. He pointed to the statue. "For years, you've bowed to it," he said. "But did you ever truly see it?" "I watched." He continued, "As you passed it daily, you chanted, you offered, but your eyes were somewhere else." And then, pointing to the black dot, he said, "Now, you look." The villagers were stunned. The priest, at first, was furious. But then, something in his face softened, because he knew. He, too, had chanted without presence, bowed without breath, seen without seeing. The black dot was removed weeks later, but its trace remained not on stone, but in memory. From that day on, villagers didn't just bow. They paused, they felt, they looked, not at the nose, but at the hole. And for the first time in many years, the Buddha smiled, not only in stone, but in them. Before the black dot appeared on the Buddha's nose, no one ever questioned the man named Riku. He was quiet, respectful, ordinary. He smiled when greeted. He bowed when passing the temple. He gave offerings of grain even in years when the harvest was thin. But if someone had looked a little closer, they might have seen the way he lingered, not with reverence, but with ache. Riku had been raised in the village. His father died young. His mother worked at the temple sweeping, folding robes, chanting softly when no one watched. Riku would often sit behind her as she bowed, not understanding why, only sensing that in the silence of her movement, there was something sacred. So he followed, learned the chants, learned the forms, learned to say the right things at the right times. He was praised for his devotion. Elders said he had a monk's heart, but what he had, truly, was a hunger, not for ritual, but for meaning. In his 20s, Riku left for the monastery in the city. There, he studied scriptures for years, memorized the Eightfold Path, the 12 links, the 108 defilements. He bowed 1,000 times until his knees cracked, but inside, it was still quiet. Too quiet. Not the stillness of peace, but of emptiness. Something was missing. When he returned home to marry, he buried the doubt beneath duty. He had a wife who laughed like water, a daughter who smelled of sun and earth and rice fields. He did what good men did. He worked, provided, worshipped, and yet, each time he bowed before the Buddha, something inside him whispered, "This isn't it." But he didn't have the courage to say it aloud, until the drought came. Crops died. His wife grew thin from worry. His daughter Mai coughed at night and couldn't sleep. He brought her to the temple. laid her before the statue, offered incense, gold coins, tears. He begged the Buddha for help, and still, nothing. She worsened. One night, she looked up at him and asked, "Papa, when I die, will the Buddha be there?" Riku couldn't answer. He held her close, heart pounding. She passed before sunrise, and in that moment, all the chants, all the bows, all the knowledge dissolved. The Buddha smiled. Stone lips curved in a peace Riku could not feel. That smile, once comforting, now felt like silence in the face of fire. He bowed, not from reverence, but from habit. Then, he stood. His hand reached for the ink pot beside the altar, a simple pot meant for copying sutras. With slow breath, he dipped the brush. One stroke, black, round, quiet, right on the bridge of the Buddha's nose. Then he sat and waited, not for punishment, but for attention, because for the first time in his life, he wanted them to see not just the statue, but the distance between the form and the feeling, the ritual and the reality. When the villagers found him, they were outraged. To them, he was the defiler. But Riku said nothing. He didn't defend. He didn't resist. He only said, "Now you are looking." And it was true. For years, they had bowed with heads lowered. Now, their eyes were open. The priest came to him later. In private, why he asked. Riku replied, "Because I needed to know if the Buddha was still here." "Is he?" the priest asked. Riku smiled faintly. "In my daughter's final breath, I saw no statue, but I felt her small hand and the warmth of love. That," he said, "was Buddha." The priest wept, not because Riku was right, but because he understood. They cleaned the mark days later, but some say it never truly faded. It became a myth, a lesson, a wound. And Riku, he lived quietly after. He tended the temple garden. He played with children. He listened more than he spoke. He no longer bowed with form, but with presence. No longer sought answers, but offered attention. And in that quiet life, free from ritual but full of meaning, he found what he had always searched for, not in the perfection of the statue, but in the imperfection of being human. And so, the black dot remained not on the stone, but in the hearts of those who finally saw. The village elder, Gendo, was a man whose silence carried more weight than most men's speeches. He had lived through 5 generations, outlasted storms, rebuilt homes, presided over weddings and funerals alike. His voice, though rarely raised, was the kind that made people lean in. So when word spread that someone had defaced the Buddha statue, the villagers turned to him not for punishment, but for clarity. Gendo arrived at the temple slowly, leaning on his walking stick. He stood before the crowd, who parted respectfully, revealing the statue still serene, but marked by a single black dot on the nose. He looked at the mark, then at Riku, sitting on the steps, with his hands resting in his lap. He said nothing. Not then, not yet. That evening, Gendo sat alone in his house, the oil lamp flickering across the old wooden beams. The statue's image stayed with him, that calm, smiling Buddha unmoving in the face of years, prayers, incense, and now, defaced. But was it he thought back to his own routine? The incense he lit each morning, the quick bow before breakfast, the words he recited without tasting their weight. And suddenly, It struck him he couldn't remember the last time he had really seen the Buddha's face. He had looked, but had he seen? He lit a single candle and stared at the flame. Memory stirred his boyhood. The first time he'd stepped into the temple. The awe that filled his chest. The weight of silence that made even his breath feel sacred. Where had that feeling gone? Had time dulled it, or had repetition masked it? The black dot. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't respectful. But it had made everyone stop. Everyone look. Even him. And perhaps that was its purpose. He returned to the temple alone before dawn the next day. No one saw him arrive. He knelt, not out of habit, but from a place deeper, a place he hadn't touched in decades. He whispered not a prayer, but a question. What am I bowing to? And the stillness answered not with words, but with a feeling. Humility, presence, realness. When the sun rose, Gendo stood slowly, feeling his joints protest, his breath heavy, but his chest light. He looked at the statue again, and this time, it smiled differently, not because its lips had changed, but because Gendo had. He left the temple and called for a village meeting. People gathered, expecting anger, judgment. Instead, Gendo stood before them and said, I once believed the sacred could be harmed by ink. He paused, but I have come to believe the real harm is when we no longer feel what is sacred. The villagers murmured. He raised his hand gently. Riku's act was not proper, but it was a mirror, one we all need to look into. Some protested, others listened, a few nodded, and Gendo said, It is time we ask not who defiled the statue, but who forgot to see it. The silence that followed was not of tension, but of awakening. After the silence, Gendo stepped down from the temple's stone platform and walked among the people, not as a judge, but as one of them. He did not propose punishment. He proposed a path. The next morning, he called for the village's carpenters, potters, farmers, teachers, and monks. He invited them not to a meeting, but to an offering. He stood before the empty courtyard beside the temple and said, Let us build something not to replace the Buddha, but to remember him. They were confused at first, but he continued, For years, we bowed to the statue and called it sacred, but we forgot the sacred in our hands, in our breath, in each other. He proposed they build a new space, not a hall of perfection, but a hall of experience. No gold, no stone, no high pedestal. Instead, he asked for each villager to bring one object from their life, something that held meaning, not status. A spoon passed down from a grandmother, a fishing net with torn edges, a child's drawing of a bird. He asked the monk to bring not the finest robe, but the one most worn from use. He asked the potter to bring a cracked bowl still whole, still beautiful. This, he said, will be our living altar. And every month, he added, we will gather, not to chant by memory, but to share one thing we truly saw, truly felt, a kindness, a moment of stillness, a breath we didn't rush. People didn't cheer. They nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, and that was enough. In the days that followed, the villagers brought their offerings. They cleared a space beside the temple under a banyan tree. No roof, only sky. They called it the place of presence. The first gathering was quiet, awkward, until an old woman stepped forward and held up a cloth stained with her husband's ink, smudged from the day he had written her a poem in the rain. He was no poet, she said, but that day, I loved him more than ever. The crowd laughed gently, then quieted. Another man spoke of his son's first steps. A child spoke of planting a seed and seeing it sprout. No lessons, only life. Gendo watched it all and knew. This was the answer Riku had tried to give. Not destruction, but disruption. To awaken the village not from faith, but from forgetting. And it worked. People still visited the temple, still bowed to the statue. But now, they also bowed to the bowl they ate from, the hand they held, the wind that passed between branches. The statue remained sacred, but it no longer stood alone. It had been joined by the sacredness of daily life, of presence, of now. Gendo thanked Riku, quietly. One evening by the river, I was afraid, he admitted. Riku smiled. So was I. You broke something, Gendo said. I broke what was already hollow, Riku replied. They sat in silence after that. Two men, no robes, no rank, just presence. And when they rose, they bowed not to each other, not to the river, but to the space between them, empty, still, alive. In that bow, a temple stood, one that no brushstroke could deface. There's something seductive about perfection. A statue without blemish, a prayer recited without pause, a ritual performed with exactitude. Over time, people begin to believe that perfection is what makes something sacred. They forget the sacred is not in the symmetry, but in the sincerity. And yet, many cling to form because it is safe, repeatable, admired. It gives the illusion of control. In the village, the Buddha statue had become more than symbol. It had become untouchable. Even as people hurried past each other in daily life, even as they spoke harshly at home or turned their eyes away from suffering, they returned to the temple and bowed before the statue, convinced that this act preserved their righteousness. But something had grown hollow. They did not know it until the black dot appeared, and when it did, their first instinct was to protect the form, not ask why it was challenged. They saw desecration, not awakening. They reacted with anger, not inquiry, but Gendo, the elder, saw something deeper. He recognized in himself the same blindness, this slow forgetting that had crept in over the years, the slow erosion of meaning, masked by habit, the loss of feeling, replaced by repetition. The sacred was never meant to be rigid. It was meant to be lived. But rigidity is comforting. People can measure it, compare it, enforce it. A chant mispronounced can be corrected. A robe worn improperly can be scolded. A mark on a statue can be removed. But what of a prayer whispered with no heart? What of a bow offered with no presence? There is no one to scold that. And so, it is ignored. And so, it continues. Form becomes performance. Devotion becomes display. And the sacred, it slips quietly out the back door. The irony is painful. A statue of the Buddha who taught impermanence, who cautioned against attachment, becomes the very thing to which people attach. They worship the symbol, while ignoring the message. They fear a dot on the nose more than the disconnection in their own hearts. But sacredness cannot be harmed by ink, only forgotten through absence. The mark Riku made was not vandalism. It was an invitation, to see again, to feel again, to ask, what am I really bowing to? Not the stone, not the face, but the stillness behind my breath, the compassion I deny in others, the awareness I rarely meet in myself in truth. Sacredness lives in the unspoken, in the quiet between words, in the breath between thoughts, in the space where form falls away and only presence remains. And when we return to that presence, everything becomes sacred again. The meal, the hand, the sorrow, the smile, not because they're flawless, but because they're real, because they ask nothing but our attention. This, perhaps, is the deeper challenge, to stop polishing statues while letting the soul gather dust, to stop fearing the imperfect and begin embracing the intimate, to let go of the shrine outside and discover the altar within. Only then can form come alive again. Only then can we bow not to marble, but to the mystery pulsing through this very moment. After the black dot, and after the stillness that followed, something subtle began to shift in the village, not in the statues, but in the way people walked. They paused more, spoke softer, listened longer, and slowly. A new understanding began to bloom, one that had no name, no robe, no doctrine, only presence. It was Gendo who first put it into words, though he did not intend to. One morning, while helping a child replant a toppled flower, he said, almost to himself, "This is also sacred." The boy looked up, puzzled. Gendo smiled, not because it's a ritual, but because we're here, together, with care. And that was the beginning of a new kind of shrine, one not built of stone or gold, but of awareness, of choice, of love. From then on, villagers began to notice the sacred not only in temples, but in kitchens, gardens, and moments of quiet between friends. A mother humming while she braided her daughter's hair, a grandfather fixing a broken chair without a single word, two friends sharing a plum in the shade. These were no longer just moments. They became offerings. They became reminders. They became enough. The temple remained. It was still respected. But now, it was joined by 1,000 silent altars scattered across the village. Each life became a scripture. Each act of kindness, a verse. Each breath taken fully, with awareness, a prayer. And in this way, the sacred returned to where it had always belonged, not separate from life, but woven through it, not above the world, but inside it, not guarded by rules, but revealed through love. People still made mistakes. They still forgot, still argued, stumbled, grieved. But now, when they remembered, they returned not to a statue, but to themselves, to the space inside that asked for nothing but presence, to the place where the divine wore no face, only warmth, only now, in time. The village came to see that nothing had been lost in the black dot. Something had been found. And perhaps that was always the point. Not to preserve the sacred in glass cases, but to let it walk with us, in muddy shoes, with tired hands, with hearts still learning how to stay open. And in this way, the sacred lived again. In the heart of meditation, there is no striving for flawlessness. There is no gold star at the end of a perfect breath. No applause for sitting still with the straightest spine. There is only presence. There is only this moment. And this moment, like all moments, is imperfect. It trembles. It forgets. It aches and wanders and returns. This is not failure. This is the practice. Many come to meditation hoping to fix something to quiet the mind, to control the breath, to erase sorrow. But meditation is not erasure. It is embrace. And to embrace something means to touch it as it is not as it should be. This is where the heart of intentional imperfection begins. In a world obsessed with polishing, with editing, with perfecting, meditation offers something wildly countercultural, an invitation to be messy, to be raw, to be unfinished and still worthy. There is an old Japanese aesthetic called wabi-sabi. It honors the cracked bowl, the faded cloth, the asymmetrical garden, not as lesser, but as more true, more alive. Wabi-sabi sees beauty not in spite of flaws, but because of them. A cup with a chip tells a story. A wall with weathered paint holds memory. A life with mistakes is real. And so it is with the inner life. In meditation, the mind wanders, the knees ache, the thoughts yell, and we breathe, not to fix these things, but to witness them, with kindness, with space. There is a Zen story about a student who asks his teacher, "What do I do with all the thoughts that disturb my meditation?" The master replies, "Let them come. Let them go. Just don't serve them tea." Imperfection is not a flaw in the path. It is the path. Each stumble is part of the walk. Each breath that escapes attention is another reminder to return. And every return is a soft bow toward life. Even temples know this. In some traditions, builders will intentionally place one imperfect stone in a wall because only the gods are perfect, and to pretend otherwise is pride. In other places, tea bowls are repaired with gold, highlighting the cracks, not hiding them. This is called kintsugi. It says, what is broken can be mended, and the mending is part of its beauty. Can we treat our own hearts this way? Not rush to smooth the scars, but gild them, honor them, sit with them in silence, like old friends who no longer need to speak. This is what meditation teaches, not in theory, but in experience. You sit, the mind runs, you breathe, the pain rises, you stay, you want to leave, you stay, and in that staying, something shifts, not dramatically, but deeply, like a tree growing a new ring in the dark of night, like a wound becoming a whisper, slow, quiet, true. Meditation isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more yourself. The self that can feel deeply. The self that can hold sorrow without collapsing. The self that can laugh in the middle of grief. Not because grief is gone, but because life still flows, still breathes, still invites. This practice is not linear. It spirals. It repeats. It forgets and remembers and forgets again. And still, it is worthy. Just like you, who sits not in perfection, but in sincerity. You, who wakes each day with both fear and courage. You, who dares to be present in a world that begs for distraction. There is nothing more beautiful than this, than being fully here, even in pieces, even with questions, even when the breath is shallow and the mind is loud, because here, in this very moment, is the only temple that cannot be destroyed, and it welcomes you exactly as you are. Walk through any modern city and you'll feel it. The pressure to be more, to do more, to look better, to succeed faster. Perfect skin. perfect family, perfect home office setup, perfect spiritual practice. Even we post sunrise meditations with latte art and hashtags like blessed and our Zen life, but inside, we're crumbling. Because perfection, in this age, isn't a gentle aspiration, it's a demand. It's a lens through which we judge ourselves daily. And quietly, relentlessly, it robs us of the sacred. Perfection was once an ideal pursued by craftsmen knowing it was unreachable, but letting the pursuit itself refine them. Today, it's a cage, a checklist, a standard no one agreed to, but everyone feels bound by, especially in the digital age. Every image is filtered, every flaw edited, every smile curated. We don't just scroll through photos, we scroll through lives that feel shinier than ours. We compare our behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. And when we don't measure up, we don't blame the illusion. We blame ourselves. We hustle harder, buy more, punish our bodies, push our minds, hide our wounds, until exhaustion feels like virtue and silence feels like failure. But the cost is staggering. Burnout, loneliness, anxiety wrapped in designer clothes. Even our spiritual practices become performative. We want results. We track our mindfulness minutes. We compete over who's more healed. But healing is not a competition. And mindfulness is not an achievement. It's a return, a remembering of what it means to be here, now. As we are, the truth is, perfection is not human. It's not real. And chasing it disconnects us from everything that is, our friends, our partners, our breath. No one wants to be loved for being flawless. We want to be seen in our mess, our moods, our mornings after we've cried. We want to be held when we're unshaven, unshowered, unshiny, because that's where truth lives. And truth is what heals, not the mask, but the face beneath, not the posture, but the pulse. In modern life, the invitation isn't to become perfect. It's to become present, to make peace with the wrinkle, the scar, the unwashed dish, to let go of the spreadsheet version of our life and sit, just once, in a moment that needs no improvement. This is where meditation reclaims its power, not as escape, but as encounter, not as a break from imperfection, but as a meeting with it. It says you are not broken for being tired. You are not failing for feeling lost. You are not behind for not having it all figured out. You are alive, and alive means unfolding. It means cracking open and being seen. It means loving the bruise, not just the bloom. In a world screaming be more, meditation whispers, just be. And in that whisper, there is revolution. Because when we stop trying to be perfect, we become something far more powerful, real. And being real raw, tender, incomplete is what opens the door to connection, to love, to the sacred we've been chasing in all the wrong places. So breathe gently and remember, there's nothing more whole than a heart that knows how to hold its own cracks. And so we return, not to the beginning, but to the breath, to the simple truth that in this life, messy, aching, sacred, what we're seeking has never been far. We looked for peace in statues, in perfect days, in flawless images, but peace has always lived in the imperfect now. A cracked bowl, a quiet tear, a black dot on the nose of a silent Buddha. Each story we've shared of Riku, of Teisui, of Basui, of June is not about others. It is about us, about the parts of us that long to be seen beyond our masks, that want to sit, not as someone impressive, but as someone real. Because when we stop chasing the idea of a perfect life, we make space for a more honest one. And that honesty is healing. That stillness is sacred. That attention is love. So as you move through your day, I invite you don't rush past the small things, the texture of your breath, the weight of your feet on the ground, the way sunlight lands on the kitchen floor. Let these be your altar. Let this moment, ordinary, fleeting, flawed, be enough. If this journey has stirred something within you, gently let it grow, like a seed beneath the soil. And if you feel called, support this space like this video. Share your reflection in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. In our next episode, we'll step into the world of Zen riddles, those strange, beautiful koans that make the mind stumble and the heart awaken. Until then, breathe gently, live honestly, and remember, the sacred is not something you find, it's something you remember.